April 13th, 1969. Dawn slid into the Shau Valley as a low, dirty grey, heavy with jungle mist and the sour smell of diesel that never quite left your clothes. On the turret roof of M48A3 Patton C-23, Staff Sergeant Mike Harlan sat half out of his commander's cupola, watching the tree line and trying not to picture what an RPG would do to the man sitting just below his boots. He was 27, on his second tour, with skin burned 3 different shades of brown and eyes that no longer widened when things exploded. The red mud of Route 548 sucked at the tracks of the armoured column as it crawled forward, Pattons up front, M113s and trucks behind, infantry riding where they could. It was supposed to be a route clearance and resupply run to a fire support base at the valley's far end. On the map, that looked simple. On the ground, nothing in the ashore was ever simple. The war was in its exhausted middle years. Tet was behind them, the big withdrawals still ahead. Armour in Vietnam had started as a doctrinal afterthought, but reality had forced M48s into roles no manual had imagined. Mobile bunkers, road openers, fire bases on tracks. C-23 belonged to Charlie Company, 169th Armour, attached to the 4th Infantry Division. The Patton was a brute, nearly 50 tons, a 90mm main gun, cokes and commanders. 50 cal up top. On training ranges back home, it was invincible. In valleys like this, with jungle pressed tight to the road and ridgelines looming over every move, it felt oddly naked. 11 weeks earlier, on this same road, naked had almost meant dead. That first time through the valley, intelligence had promised light and scattered contact. The villagers had smiled too broadly, the cooking fires had been too fresh, and the silence between bird calls had been a little too clean. Harlan's platoon had rolled anyway. The lead tank punched through a shallow curve, and the world turned into white smoke trails and orange blossoms of fire. An RPG hit B-12's turret ring at 20 meters. The shape charge speared into the crew compartment, and the tank went from moving to burning, without any intermediate steps. Another rocket smashed into the hull of the 3rd Patton, crippling its track. C-23 got off with a hit to the external stowage boxes, losing rations and a sleeping bag instead of men. They dragged the survivors and the bodies away under mortar fire, and spent that night listening to artillery flog the slopes around them. The smell of burned flesh and molten steel settled into their memories like smoke in fabric. After that ambush, every tanker in Charlie Company had a new relationship with the phrase armour protection. They knew the M48's strengths: thick glacis plate, heavy turret front, solid hull. They also knew its soft spots: the hull sides above the tracks, the turret ring, the engine deck, the relatively thin armour around the driver's station. RPG gunners had started aiming for those seams with terrifying skill. Rumour carried an answer before any official directive did. Somewhere near Hugh, another unit had started welding captured VC armour onto their Pattons, plates cut from knocked-out enemy tanks, bolted and welded over vulnerable areas. It was a half-joke, half-miracle tale that ran through mess tents and motor pools. No one could quite say who had done it first, but the idea struck deep. Enemy steel turned into your shield. C-23 already wore the proof. Her bow carried a section of curved glacis scavenged from a Soviet-built PT-76, cut to fit and stitched on with ugly, thick welds. Both turret cheeks bore foreign plates, slightly different in color from the American cast steel beneath. Faint traces of Cyrillic barely visible under paint. Spare track links, some US, some captured T-54, hung welded over the hull sides and rear. It made the tank heavier, slower to respond, and rougher on fuel. But when Harlan ran his hand over those plates in the dim pre-dawn, he felt a kind of rough comfort. Every extra millimeter of steel was a favor he'd done his crew in advance. In the cupola, he scanned through periscopes set to a rhythm he no longer had to think about: tree line, ridge line, drainage ditch, sky. Below, his crew were voices on the intercom and movements in the steel around him. Moose Kearney, the gunner, hunched behind the sight, left hand on the elevation wheel, right hand on the power traverse handles. Private Rojas, the loader, sat by the ammo racks, his gloved hand resting on the first heat round in the sequence. In the hull, driver PFC Jenkins peered through his periscope, feeling every rut through his seat and tillers. On the battalion net, call signs murmured over the crackle of static. Blackjack 6, this is Blackjack 1-2, entering kill zone section. No movement observed, over. Blackjack 1-2-6, roger. Maintain 50-meter interval. Keep your infantry close. Out. Harlan keyed his own radio. Blackjack 3-2, copies all. Still green. No joy on movement. Out. His voice didn't show it, but his shoulders were tight under his flak vest. The A Shau didn't have to repeat its lessons, but it often did. The column crept into a stretch of road, hemmed close by jungle on both sides, ridges rising like folded arms. The air felt heavier, sound oddly damped. Somewhere out there, unseen men were watching them through bamboo slits and scope reticles, deciding which tank would be the first to die. The first RPG of the day came at 09:37 hours, a white streak knifing out of the left-hand trees towards C-23's nose, fast as a thought and just as unstoppable. The whoosh of the rocket motor was subtle, a breathy sound that barely rose above the rumble of engines and clank of track. Tank crews in Vietnam learned to hear it with their bones before their brains named it. Harlan caught the movement in his forward periscope, the smoke trail, the angle, the realization, in one compressed, icy instant, that it was coming straight for him. The rocket hit just above the right front fender, exactly where the added PT-76 plate overlapped the Patton's original glacis. There was a flat, brutal crack and a shower of sparks. The tank shuddered, Jenkins instinctively tugged the tillers, and mud sprayed as C-23 swerved. Inside, the crew felt a heavy metallic punch, followed by the rattle of loose gear, but there was no blinding flash, no molten jet ripping through the driver's compartment, no sudden inferno. "Hit front!" Rojas yelled anyway, reflex ahead of reason. "Driver," Harlan barked. "I'm good, no breach," Jenkins replied, voice high but steady. "Gunner coax, tree line left, 10 o'clock RPG team," Harlan snapped. "Identified," Moose said, and the coaxial machine gun stuttered to life. Tracers walked into the greenery where the backblast had blossomed. Leaves shredded, and a dark shape flopped sideways, but more muzzle flashes winked to life, up and down the slope. The second RPG found softer meat. It slammed into the side of the M113 behind them. That blast was deeper, hungrier. Flame licked from the open cargo hatch, and infantry poured out, some on their feet, some not. The company net dissolved into overlapping cries. "Blackjack 2-1 is hit, we're on fire!" Contact left and right, multiple RPGs. "Cease stepping on each other," the battalion commander roared through the chaos. "All Blackjacks, execute counter-ambush. Press, left tree line, left tree line." Harlan dropped fully inside the cupola and clamped his hatch. The world shrank to green-tinted vision blocks and the nervous energy in the turret. He pivoted C-23's commander's sight, marking muzzle flashes and faint silhouettes in the undergrowth. "Loader, heat up," he ordered. "Heat up," Rojas echoed, muscling the 90mm round into the breech, brass clanging against steel. "Gunner, tree line left, mid-slope, 3-round rapid, fire at will." The turret slewed with a mechanical whine, and Moose's voice flattened out as he entered the zone tankers lived for and feared. "On the way!" The 90mm barked, the recoil slamming back. Outside, a section of jungle exploded, a white-orange blossom that ripped vines and men into the air. Moose corrected, fired again, then again, riding the gun through recoil, Rojas feeding rounds like a metronome. The ambush wasn't a single volley, it was a layered design. On the left, low bunker mouths and spider holes spewed RPGs and AK fire into the road. On the right, higher up the slope, another team fired a recoilless rifle, its distinct thump and backblast cloud giving away its position. Beyond, across a small ravine parallel to the road, more silhouettes flickered, a crossfire designed to catch tanks, personnel carriers, and trucks in a permanent L-shaped trap. The NVA and VC had studied tanks the same way tankers studied ambush drills. They knew where to aim: hull sides, turret rings, rear decks. They'd built their firing points accordingly, angled and spaced so that, if one team died, another could take over its sector. This was not a random spray of fire, it was a geometry of killing. C-23's extra metal started earning its keep. A second RPG hit the added plate on the bow, gouging a black crater that left the foreign steel warped and smoking, but did not punch through. A third slammed into the right rear corner, where spare track links and a scrap of hull plate from a dead T-54 had been welded on. The blast shredded the track links and showered the area with shrapnel, but the fuel cells stayed intact, the engine kept turning, and the crew compartment stayed dark instead of bright. To Harlan's left, B-15, a sister Patton named Hard Luck, lurched forward, moving into a rough wedge with C-23 to cover the damaged M113 and trucks. Its turret looked like a medieval helmet, covered in welded track and scavenged plates. An RPG hit its turret side, detonating against a slab of XPT-76 glacis. The plate buckled, welds spitting sparks, but again there was no catastrophic flash inside. The infantry, shaken but recovering, began to claw the ditches and tree lines. Some dismounted under fire, using the tanks as moving cover, firing from behind the Pattons' armored flanks. A forward observer, half hidden behind a road cut, screamed adjustments into his radio, dragooning 105s from a distant fire base onto the ridges. The valley filled with layers of smoke, RPG backblast white, burning diesel black, artillery grey. Visibility shrank, then flickered open in brief windows, like a strobe. Through those gaps, Harlan and Moose hunted RPG teams and recoilless crews, trusting instinct and the muzzle flashes that betrayed them. Minutes stretched and folded. When the firing finally tapered off, replaced by sporadic crackles and the distant rumble of still-falling artillery, Route 548 looked like a bruise. One M113 burned in the ditch. A fuel truck lay on its side, wheels slowly turning. 3 tanks bore fresh scars, armor scorched and cratered. Later, the Battalion S3 would write it up as ambush repelled with moderate friendly casualties and heavy enemy losses. The line about armor would be brief. Field-expedient armor modifications appeared to reduce RPG effectiveness against several vehicles. For C-23's crew, the report was irrelevant. What mattered was the moment of impact when that first rocket hit the VC armor and the tank stayed alive. It turned rumor into fact. The enemy's own steel had just kept 4 Americans breathing. That night, in the forward maintenance area, welders traced the blackened craters on C-23's plates with gloved fingers. One nodded slowly. "If this plate wasn't here," he said to Jenkins, tapping the damaged metal, "that jet goes straight into your lap." Jenkins stared at the crater where his entire world had almost ended. "Guess Charlie donated me a front bumper," he said. The joke wasn't funny, but it stuck. VC armor stopped being a rumor and became the name for every extra plate anyone could scrounge. The steel that ended up on C-23's nose started its life on the other side of the war. On the coastal plain near Hugh, months earlier, US and ARVN forces had smashed an NVA thrust along Route 1. PT-76 amphibious tanks and a handful of T-54s had tried to cut the road, gambling that surprise, and numbers would compensate for inferior fire control. They'd lost. Airstrikes and dug-in Pattons had turned the paddies into a graveyard of burned hulls and blackened turret rings. In a dusty forward salvage yard afterward, engineers and ordnance personnel crawled over those wrecks. The heat there was different from the highlands, flatter, thick with salt and rot from nearby paddies. They stripped radios, optics, and intact weapons for intelligence. Tracks and wheels went one way, small parts another. The gutted hulls sat like hulks of beached whales, paint-blistered Soviet and Chinese serial numbers exposed under peeling layers. It was there, among cutting torches and piles of scrap, that some nameless sergeant first said, "Sir, why can't we use this?" and pointed not to a gun or a radio, but to armor. Armor doctrine didn't cover welding foreign plate onto American tanks. Ordnance officers worried about metallurgy, about stress, about how a Soviet alloy would fuse with American cast steel. But they also read casualty reports. Shape-charge weapons were chewing through flanks and turret rings at ranges barely longer than a football field. Every RPG that penetrated meant a funeral detail, so they tried it. A test M48 in the yard got a few welded plates bolted to its sides. A section of T-54 turret front here, a PT-76 glacis there. Welds were rough, cut lines uneven. They set up charges to simulate RPG hits, standing back as the explosives detonated. The plates bent, cratered, sometimes cracked. But in many cases, the shaped charge's jet was degraded enough that it failed to fully penetrate the underlying armor. Where a clean hit might once have punched into the crew space, now it created only spall and dents. The data wasn't perfect, but it was good enough for men who expected to be shot at tomorrow. Word filtered to line companies faster than any formal report, through coffee, cigarettes, and the timeless military network of friends of friends. When Harlan first walked around an M48 sporting captured armor in a rear area in March, he felt like he was looking at a creature midway through evolution. The tank's hull sides carried darker plates, bolted and welded over the original steel. The turret cheeks were bulked out by curved sections of ex-enemy glacis. Spare track links dangled on welded brackets across the bow. It looked ugly and strangely inspiring. "We took 2 hits yesterday," that tank's commander told him, tapping one cratered plate. "Both here. Without it, my gunner and driver are ghosts." Back in the Central Highlands, Charlie Company didn't have a neat stockpile of captured armor. But war has its own supply chain. ARVN forces knocked out a lone PT-76 near a flooded paddy close to the Cambodian border. Word spread that the hulk was reachable by a short slog from a makeshift LZ. A mixed scavenger team, American tankers, ARVN soldiers, a couple of Seabees with torches, went to work. The PT-76 sat half-submerged, turret blown askew, mud sucking at its tracks. They climbed onto its hull, boots slipping on algae and soot. The cutting torches spat orange light and showers of sparks as they sliced armor plate free. Sections of glacis and hullside fell onto improvised rafts made from bridging planks and fuel drums. What had been enemy skin a week before started a second life on the back of a CH-47 helicopter, dangling under its rotors on a sling. At the forward maintenance point, the plates joined other scavenged pieces. Fragments from destroyed T-54s, chunks of old French hulls dragged from ditches, even scrap from wrecked American vehicles. The motor pool welders became ad hoc armor designers. They chalked cut lines on each piece, testing it against the curves of M48 hulls and turrets. Torches flared, grinders shrieked, the air filled with the smell of vaporized paint and hot steel. Harlan hovered like an anxious father as they worked on C-23. A thick PT-76 slab went on the bow. Smaller pieces bolted and welded onto the turret cheeks. Spare track links were welded in rows along the hull sides, overlapping like scales. The welds would have horrified a stateside inspector, too heavy, too irregular, but they were strong. Jenkins, the driver, was the first to complain about the extra weight. "She's sluggish now," he grumbled on a test run. "Feels like she's hauling a trailer full of rocks." "She is," Harlan said. "Rocks that can stop molten copper." Fuel consumption ticked up. The Patton suspension groaned a little louder over bumps. But when maintenance crews detonated a test charge against one of the new plates and only scorched steel instead of daylight showed through, no one suggested taking them off. Charlie Company wasn't alone. Other units copied or improvised their own versions. Some welded on nothing but spare track. Others hung sandbags in racks around vulnerable points, hoping the extra mass would disrupt jets. Gun trucks in convoys got their own field armor, steel plates, welded scrap, anything that could catch a bullet or a fragment. None of it was authorized in neat printed orders. On paper, the M48 remained as designed in Detroit. In reality, along red roads and in green valleys, the tanks took on new shapes. When Harlan's platoon rolled back into the Shau with VC armor stitched to their hulls, they were part of a quiet, unofficial experiment, men betting their lives that enemy steel could be turned into a life insurance policy. The Valley fired the first exam paper that morning. The plates passed. The second and hardest test, the one that would truly define C-23's legend, would come in a different place, against a more intricate ambush, when simply adding steel wasn't enough. The tank would lose her mobility, the enemy would close, and the welded armor would buy time measured in heartbeats. The ridge didn't even have a name on most maps, just a thin contour line near the Cambodian border. On May 21, 1969, it became a place every tanker in 169th Armor would remember. The column moved along its spine under a sun that felt close enough to touch. Red dust rose in clouds behind the vehicles, coating uniforms and goggles, turning everything the same tired color. On the left side of the road, the ground fell away steeply into a tangled valley. On the right, the slope climbed into brush, chopped by shallow draws. It was classic ambush terrain, a saddle between two rises, nowhere to maneuver, no cover but the steel you brought with you. Everyone saw it. The lead tank, Blackjack 1-1, slowed, scanning. Infantry dismounts shifted grips on their rifles, eyes cutting over the vegetation. In the air, even the birds seemed to quiet for a moment. The enemy struck when the first three vehicles were in the low point, and the rest were committed. A 75mm recoilless rifle on the right slope fired first, its muzzle blast a sudden white bloom in the brush. The round smashed into Blackjack 1-1's left hull near the turret ring. The shaped charge tore through armor and into the fighting compartment. The tank staggered, then slid to a stop, black smoke pouring from its hatches. RPGs followed from both sides. The left slope, the downhill side, hid firing points dug just below the crest, narrow slits giving gunners a clear view of the road. The right slope bristled with spider holes and trenches. The first rockets hit an M113 and a fuel truck. The personnel carrier's front plate was too thin. The rocket's jet carved through and turned the interior into a hurricane of metal and flesh. The fuel truck went up in a sheet of flame that rolled across the road. For a moment, radio nets dissolved into raw noise, shouts, curses, overlapping call signs. Somewhere, a forward observer found his voice and screamed for artillery on pre-plotted targets. Somewhere else, someone just yelled into the ether. Harlan slammed his hatch shut as splinters rained onto C-23's turret. "Contact front and both flanks," he called over the intercom. "Driver, hold! Gunner, find that recoilless!" Moose searched through his scope, ignoring the RPG streaks, hunting for the recoilless's signature. There, a lingering haze and broken brush halfway up the right slope. He walked the reticle onto it. "Identified," he said. "Fire!" The 90mm roared, and the hillside spat dirt and foliage. One more shell drove into the same patch. The recoilless signature vanished. Whether the gun itself was destroyed or the crew had simply fled, the heavy threat on that side went quiet for precious seconds. An RPG slammed into the turret cheek of C-23, punching the PT-76 plate so hard that interior fittings rattled. Paint dust fell like grey snow. A fragment nicked Rojas's cheek, drawing a thin line of blood. But there was no penetration, no burning jet. "Hit left! Plate held!" Moose shouted, more to reassure himself than anyone else. Ahead, an unmodified M48 took a rocket near the driver's hatch. This time, there was nothing extra to chew the jet. The blast punched through, and the driver's station went from steel and switches to fire and smoke. The tank lurched sideways, track grinding as the driver spasmed, then sagged into the ditch. Flames licked under its hull, and a moment later, its ammunition cooked off, popping the turret like a lid. The NVA read the field as quickly as any US officer. RPG teams shifted, trying to flank the Frankenstein tanks, looking for unprotected angles. Some scrambled downhill, seeking shots up into bellies. Others moved along narrow animal paths, circling to fire into rear decks. Artillery began to fall, shells walking along the slopes. The ridge shook under the impacts. Smoke rounds added a shifting curtain of white to the existing black and grey. Overhead, Cobras arrived, their stub wings bristling with rockets. They dove along the ridge, miniguns saw whining, rockets tearing new holes in the foliage. In that chaos, C-23 hit a buried mine. The blast erupted under her right track, snapping 2 road wheels and blowing the track off. The tank slammed sideways, then rocked back, engine still running but mobility gone on that side. Warning lights flared on Jenkins's panel. Dust and smoke filled the interior. "We've thrown a track, we're stuck," Jenkins yelled. Static lion roared in Harlan's ears. The worst place a tank could be in an RPG kill zone was stationary and obvious. The worst place C-23 could be right now was exactly where she was. Fear clawed at his throat, but training and stubbornness pushed it down. "Driver, pivot on the left, keep the bow toward the heaviest fire," he ordered. "We're a turret now, not a tank. Gunner, kill anything with a tube first. Loader, heat until we're dry, then canister." The tank became a rotating bunker. Jenkins worked the remaining track, grinding the hull left and right to keep the thickest armor pointed at each new threat. RPGs homed in on the crippled hulk. One detonated on the added bow plate, gouging it deeper. Another hit the jury-rigged track and plate lattice on the right hull, shredding metal but still failing to open a path into the crew space. B-15 rolled up to cover C-23's exposed flank. Its own scavenged armor bore fresh scars. At one point, a rocket struck a welded-on plate so hard that the compromised welds tore. The plate ripped loose and spun away like a giant throwing knife, burying itself in the shoulder of a nearby infantryman. Survival in war rarely comes without strange collateral damage. Under smoke cover and artillery, engineers and tank recovery crews crawled forward, hooking chains to C-23's hull. Twice, RPGs probed the smoke, exploding close enough to rock the immobilized tank. Each time, the improvised armor caught the worst of it. The crew flinched, cursed, and kept working their weapons. When the recovery vehicle finally dragged C-23 backward out of the saddle, right side grinding a trench in the road, Harlan felt both relief and a peculiar sense of loss. He wanted to stay, to keep C-23's gun in the fight, but the ridge was already littered with burning steel. Staying would have turned stubbornness into stupidity. The after-action tally was grim. One tank burned with all hands lost. The M113 was a twisted shell. The fuel truck was an ongoing column of smoke visible for miles. Several infantrymen and engineers were dead or wounded. Enemy casualties were harder to count, but measured in torn positions and bodies scattered among roots and rocks. Yet a pattern emerged as the smoke cleared and the mechanics walked the line of damaged armor. The tanks, with added plates, had taken multiple hits and remained habitable. Their extra armor was cratered, warped, in some places peeled back like tin. Behind it, crew compartments were stained with dust and sweat, not blood. In the maintenance bay later, C-23 sat up on jacks, right side stripped down, broken suspension parts removed. The added plates bore a map of impacts. The maintenance officer stood beside Harlan, clipboard in hand. "You've been hit at least 6 times by RPGs on this hull and turret in 2 fights, he said. "If those plates weren't there, we'd be zipping up bags." "Then keep welding," Harlan replied. The captain gave a tired half-smile. "You know none of this is in any manual." "Neither are most of the things that work out here," Harlan said. He watched as welders cut away ruined sections of VC armor and measured fresh pieces to replace them. The tank looked wounded, but alive. Every new bead of molten metal felt like another small argument against randomness. When Harlan stepped off the Freedom Bird at the end of 1969, the jungle seemed to follow him in invisible ways. the weight of humid air remembered in lungs, the smell of hot steel and burned fuel conjured by summertime asphalt. On paper, he was Staff Sergeant Michael Harlan, honorably discharged, awarded a Bronze Star with V and a Purple Heart. The citation mentioned in careful language improvised armor modifications that had contributed to crew survivability under intense enemy fire. Back home, captured VC armor sounded like a myth. Friends asked about firefights, not welds. The news showed protests and speeches. The idea that American tanks had gone into battle wearing pieces of Soviet-built plate cut from enemy hulls did not fit neatly into the pictures. Among other Vietnam veterans, though, the story had weight. In VFW halls, in garage gatherings over beers, they exchanged photographs, grainy color shots of Pattons with odd plates on their noses and cheeks, track links welded where clean armor once had been, fingers tapped at craters and scorch marks. "That one hit right here," someone would say, tracing a circle. "Plate took it. My driver's kids exist because of that." The U.S. Army institution absorbed the lesson more slowly. After Vietnam, analysts pored over battle reports, looking at what had worked and what hadn't. The threat of cheap, portable anti-armor weapons, RPGs and early guided missiles loomed large. Designers began to focus on side protection, ammunition compartmentalization, and standoff armor. Over time, reactive armor bricks, composite packages, and slat cages appeared on new generations of vehicles. No technical manual for the M1 Abrams, nowhere in a glossy doctrine slide, says, "We did this because crews in Vietnam welded enemy plate onto their M48s." But the DNA is there. The field expedients of one war become the formal features of the next. Improvised turret baskets and sandbagged hulls in Southeast Asia turn into engineered side skirts and blow-off panels decades later. On the other side of the conflict, North Vietnamese veterans would later remember the frustration of seeing some tanks survive hits that should have killed them. RPG crews who had been taught that one good shot would brew a Patton up had to adjust their expectations when rockets crumpled extra plates instead. They adapted in turn, changing angles, aiming for rear decks and tracks, increasing use of mines and satchel charges. The dance between armor and anti-armor remained dynamic right up to the last days of the war. Strategically, the welded plates on a handful of M48s did not alter the outcome in Vietnam. Tanks, patched or pristine, could not decide a war that hinged on politics, will, and a long chain of decisions far above any ridgeline. In April 1975, when Saigon fell, no one thought about the Frankenstein Pattons that had once ground up red roads under a different banner. But history is made up of more than outcomes. It is also made of moments where men refused to accept the odds as given. The decision by crews like Harlan's to scavenge enemy steel and bolt it over their own hearts was one of those moments. It turned the battlefield into a closed loop, a Soviet plate sent to North Vietnam as aid, welded to an NVA PT-76, destroyed by US. Fire, cut off by Seabees, flown to a maintenance yard, welded onto a Patton's bow, hit by an RPG, and finally absorbing the energy that would otherwise have killed an American driver. For Harlan, the legacy was personal, not abstract. Years later, when he allowed himself to talk about it, he described the sensation of that first rocket hitting the VC armor on Route 548. "I heard it and felt it," he'd say, "like somebody swung a sledgehammer at the hull. I was waiting for the light, the heat, the screaming. It didn't come. Instead, there was just dust and ringing ears. That plate had maybe 3 inches of life in it. Those 3 inches were mine." The memories came back in sensory flashes. The way weld seams felt under his boots, the smell of scorched paint after a near miss, the sight of a crater in foreign steel that stopped just before daylight. He remembered the look on Jenkins's face when the driver realized that the rocket that should have killed him had stopped in metal instead. For viewers today, looking at footage of tanks in Vietnam, those welded plates are easy to miss. A darker patch here, a thicker cheek there, But once you know to look for them, you can't unsee them. They're there in the background of grainy newsreels and veterans' snapshots, foreign steel turned domestic, enemy intention turned into protection. The story of why US tank crews started welding captured VC armor onto their M48 Pattons is not a tale of miracle technology. It's a story of men with torches and fear and stubborn will, working in hot motor pools to give themselves a slightly better chance of coming home. It is, in its way, one of the most honest stories the Vietnam War has to offer. Because in the end, that war was not just fought by generals and politicians, but by sergeants standing in firefly clouds of welding sparks, by drivers who felt more weight under their hands and accepted it, by gunners who kept their eyes on the sight even as rockets cratered the plates around them. It was fought by crews who looked at a burned-out enemy hull and saw not a trophy, but raw material for survival. If this journey through steel and fire changed how you see those old tanks grinding through red mud on faded film, stay with us. There are more hidden stories in the armor and dust of Vietnam, of improvisation, of quiet ingenuity, of small decisions that meant life or death inside cramped compartments of steel. Share this story with someone who thinks war is only about big arrows on maps, and if you want to keep exploring the forgotten details and human choices behind the Vietnam War, join us in the next documentary on this channel.